He was just an old man on a park bench, faded windbreaker, trembling hands, feeding birds in the early morning light. No one saw him. No one cared. Until a young army ranger jogging past stopped cold, not because of the man's face, but because of the bracelet on his wrist. A bracelet that hadn't been seen in 50 years. A bracelet that belonged to a mission the government swore never happened. That moment unraveled everything, secrets, silence, and a legacy carried across generations by those brave enough to remember. And the ghost finally spoke. The old man shuffled through the tree line at the edge of the park, a cane in one hand and a paper sack in the other. He wore the same faded windbreaker every morning, his hat pulled low, obscuring a face lined by time and secrets. Most people paid him no mind. He was just another senior citizen feeding squirrels, talking to himself, walking slow circles around the perimeter of the woods. But this morning, something changed. It was still early. The park hadn't yet filled with joggers or moms with strollers. The dew clung to the grass, and the sun filtered through the pines like liquid gold. The old man sat on his usual bench, pulling crusts of bread from the bag, his hands steady despite their age. Across the trail, a group of Army Rangers on weekend leave were doing a casual run. Their laughter carried through the crisp air. One of them, a young sergeant with close-cropped hair and a jaw like granite, slowed to a stop. He squinted at the man on the bench. "Hey," the sergeant said, not loud, not soft, just a note of confusion and curiosity in his voice. The others slowed too, following his gaze. The sergeant stepped closer. He wasn't looking at the old man's face, and he was looking at the bracelet, a dull piece of metal on a weathered wrist, nothing flashy, not even particularly shiny. But the moment the sergeant saw it, he stopped like he'd hit a wall. The others watched as he approached the bench. "Sir?" the sergeant asked carefully. The old man didn't respond at first. He just tossed another bit of bread toward a blue jay that had landed nearby. The sergeant's voice cracked. "Where did you get that bracelet?" The old man finally turned, and for the first time in years, someone truly looked into his eyes. 50 years of silence. 50 years of hiding what he had done, where he had been, who he had lost. But that bracelet, it was unique. Hand-forged in Laos. Only ever given to a handful of men, all part of an operation that technically never existed. An operation buried under layers of classified files and unmarked graves. The sergeant pointed at it, then slowly unzipped his collar. Round his neck, on a chain, was a photograph encased in plastic. "That's my grandfather," he said. The photo was creased and old, but clear enough. The old man's lips parted. Not with shock, not exactly. More like the beginning of a crack in a dam that had held for too long. He nodded once, slowly. "Yes, I remember him." The sergeant dropped to one knee. "My mom said he disappeared in 74, that he was last seen in Cambodia." "He was?" the old man replied. "You were with him?" "I was." The others crowded closer, but stayed silent. They could feel the gravity shift. Something sacred was happening. Not the kind of thing you filmed on your phone or joked about later. This was history, bleeding through the cracks of the present. "He saved my life," the old man said, "more than once." "You never came forward?" The old man shook his head. "We weren't allowed to. What we did over there, the world was never supposed to know." "But that bracelet," the sergeant said, "it's a Ranger Memorial bracelet, the only ones issued for Operation Harvest Light." The old man gave a faint smile. "That's right." The sergeant's voice dropped. "You're the ghost." The old man said nothing. For decades, stories had circulated through Ranger lore about a soldier who had vanished with a 6-man team deep behind enemy lines. The record said MIA. Some said KIA. Others, mostly dismissed as myths, claimed one had made it out. One had walked 300 miles through jungle and enemy territory. One had returned, but disappeared into civilian life, never speaking of what happened. The ghost. He'd become more of a legend than a man. Nobody knew his name. Nobody even had a photo. Until now. "You're him," the sergeant whispered. The old man looked away. Not from shame, from the weight of it. The sergeant rose. He saluted. The old man didn't return it right away. He hadn't saluted anyone in 50 years. But something inside cracked open. Slowly he raised his hand and returned the gesture. His fingers trembled. "I was 19, he said, "when I joined. Thought I knew everything. Didn't know hell until I saw it with my own eyes. Your grandfather. He was the real hero." "My mom's been trying to find out what happened for decades," the sergeant said, emotion tightening his throat. "She thought maybe he died alone, that he was forgotten." The old man swallowed hard. He wasn't alone. He reached into the inside pocket of his windbreaker and pulled out a plastic bag. Inside was a smaller bag, sealed and yellowed with age. A photograph, a ring, and a dog tag. "I carried them for 50 years, he said. The sergeant took the items reverently, unable to speak. The other rangers surrounded them, silent as ghosts themselves. One of them, tough, built like a linebacker, had tears on his cheeks. "Why now?" the sergeant finally asked. The old man looked down at the bracelet. "Because you saw me. No one ever saw me before." "Not really." Word spread faster than wildfire. By nightfall, reporters were camped outside the park. The old man wasn't there. He'd slipped away, back to a small apartment on the edge of town. But it was too late for hiding now. Within days, the Department of Defense contacted him. The files were declassified. His name was spoken aloud for the first time in decades. Master Sergeant Thomas Hawk Hawkins, Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart. Missing in action. Found. He agreed to one interview. Just one. He sat stiffly in the chair, uncomfortable under the studio lights. "They called me a hero," he said, voice gravelly. "But the real heroes didn't come home." "What kept you silent all these years?" the interviewer asked. He looked straight at the camera. "Because I made a promise." "To whom?" "To a dying friend." The next day the bracelet was returned to Fort Benning and placed in a glass case with the caption, "Master Sergeant Thomas Hawkins, the Ghost of Harvest Light." On the day of the memorial service, the sergeant brought his mother. She hadn't seen that photo, that ring, or that dog tag in over 50 years. When she held them, she wept. When she met Thomas Hawkins, she hugged him like a brother. "You were with him," she whispered. "I was," he said, voice cracking. She touched the bracelet on his wrist. "Thank you." He nodded but said nothing. The ceremony was private. Only family, a few rangers, and a bugler who played taps like the world was listening. Hawkins sat alone afterward, staring at the marble stone with her father's name now etched in granite. The sergeant came up beside him. "Want a ride?" he asked. Hawkins smiled. "Only if you drive like your grandfather." The sergeant grinned. "Reckless and loud?" "Exactly." They walked away together, 2 generations, one fading into the twilight, the other carrying the torch, 50 years of silence, and finally peace. The days after the ceremony passed quietly, but something had changed in Thomas Hawkins. For 50 years, he'd lived in the shadows, blending into grocery stores, park benches, bus stops, moving through life like a ghost. He never stayed long in one place. He never spoke at length to anyone. His neighbors barely knew his name. But now he walked differently, a little straighter, a little more sure. Word had traveled far beyond the local news. Military blogs picked it up, then national outlets, then veterans forums. Men who had served in similar operations began posting messages. "We never forgot Harvest Light. We never forgot you." Some wrote from nursing homes, others from hospital beds, a few from deep in the mountains where they'd gone to be alone. One message simply read, "You walked out for all of us." Then the letters started. At first, just a few, then a dozen. then hundreds. They came from all over the country. Families of men lost in Southeast Asia, strangers who had grown up hearing whispers of the harvest teams, even children who had worn their father's dog tags to school every year on Veterans Day, hoping one day someone would say, "I knew him." Thomas read each one, though it took time. Some made him weep, others made him laugh, but most simply made him feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time, like he mattered. He began writing back, sometimes just a sentence, sometimes whole pages. He shared stories he hadn't dared whisper in 5 decades. Not the combat, not the missions, that was still classified in parts, but the people. The way Lewis hummed Johnny Cash before a drop. The way Barker would keep a worn deck of cards in his pocket and deal out hands no one ever played. The way Halverson had cried the night they had to leave 2 behind. "They were my brothers," Thomas wrote, "and your father was one of the finest." The young sergeant, Ryan, visited often, not out of obligation. He came because something about Thomas made the past feel close and alive. And Thomas. Thomas found himself smiling more when Ryan was around. He reminded him so much of his grandfather, stubborn, brave, always 5 seconds from saying something sarcastic. They talked about everything. About war, about peace, about what it meant to live a life in between the two. Thomas taught him how to play blackjack the way rangers played in the jungle, quietly, with no words, just fingers and eye contact. Ryan brought him books, photos, letters from his unit. But there was one visit that changed everything again. It was a humid morning, the kind of day that smelled like rain and pine and old earth. Thomas was sitting on his porch when a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Ryan stepped out, but he wasn't alone. An older man stepped out behind him, stiff posture, deep wrinkles, eyes like broken glass. He wore a service pin on his collar that Thomas hadn't seen in years. Thomas stood, his hand tightening on his cane. His heart picked up. "Tommy," the man said. It had been decades since anyone called him that. "Jack," Thomas breathed. Major Jack Ellison had led the Harvest Light operation. He'd been the one to brief them, the one to send them into the jungle, and the one to sign off on the burial of the entire mission. They had assumed he was long dead. "I heard you'd surfaced," Jack said, stepping onto the porch. "And I thought you were gone." "I was. Paperwork said I was. After everything that happened, I disappeared too." The 2 men stared at each other, years pooling between them. Then Thomas nodded once and opened the screen door. They sat in silence at first. Ryan watched from the steps, knowing not to interrupt. Then Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a file. "I had this buried in a footlocker for 30 years. Wasn't supposed to keep it. Wasn't supposed to keep anything. But I couldn't let it all vanish." He slid the file toward Thomas. Inside were black and white photos. Young men in jungle fatigues, a map with red circles drawn in ink, a journal half erased with time, a final mission report. Thomas stared at the pictures. His hands trembled. "They thought we died out there," Jack said. "And in a way, we did." "I walked for 16 days, Thomas whispered, voice raw. "Only ate once, leeches in the water. Thought I was going to lose my mind, but I carried his tag and the bracelet." "You were never supposed to be forgotten," Jack said. "But politics, cover-ups, hell, half of it was just shame." Thomas closed the file. "They were the best men I ever knew." Jack nodded. "And they'll be remembered." Together, with Ryan's help, they began to piece together the true story of Operation Harvest Light. Not the propaganda, not the redacted lines in government folders. The truth. What it was like to be 19 and behind enemy lines with no way home. What it was like to see your friends die in silence. What it was like to live and wish you hadn't. Ryan organized the materials. He brought in a historian, a documentarian, a military archivist. Slowly, the puzzle came together. When the documentary aired a year later, Thomas watched it alone. He wept, not for himself, but for the 5 faces that appeared on screen, faces that hadn't been seen in 50 years. The film was called Harvested Light. It won awards, but more than that, it changed things. Families finally got answers. Names were restored on the memorial wall in Washington, D.C. A plaque was placed at Fort Benning with all 6 names, including Thomas Hawkins, listed as the sole survivor. And then, at long last, the Department of Defense held a ceremony. Not in a sterile hall, but on the field at Fort Benning, under a sky painted orange by the setting sun. There, in full-dress uniform, Master Sergeant Thomas Hawkins was given the Distinguished Service Cross. He stood tall, no cane, no shame, no silence. As the crowd applauded, Thomas turned to Ryan, who stood in formation. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Afterward, as twilight deepened, Thomas stood before the wall of names. He reached out and touched each one, whispering their names under his breath like a prayer. Then he took off the bracelet. He handed it to Ryan. "It's yours now," he said. "Carry it well." "I will," Ryan promised, voice thick. "You already are." Years later, after Thomas passed quietly in his sleep, Ryan wore that bracelet into every deployment, every mission, every dark corner of the world where light had to be fought for. And every time he felt it against his wrist, he remembered. The man who carried silence for 50 years so others could live. The ghost who came back to life. The legend that finally got to rest. The news of Thomas Hawkins's passing didn't make the front page of any national paper, but it spread like fire through the ranks. It started with a whisper, then a name, then a wave. Unit by unit, base by base, message boards and inboxes lit up with the same words, "The ghost is gone." There was no debate about what to do next. Ryan took the lead, not because he wanted to, but because he had to, because Thomas had passed the torch to him, literally placed the weight of memory on his wrist, and now it was his duty to carry it forward. He made calls, reached out to the families of the other men from Harvest Light. He called Jack Ellison, called the historian, called the Army Public Affairs Office. Then he made one more call to a woman in North Carolina, the daughter of Sergeant Lewis, who had once hummed Johnny Cash before every drop. "Ma'am," Ryan said, "I'm putting together a memorial. I think your father deserves more than a plaque. I think they all do." Her voice broke before she could respond. The Army approved the request within days. The new monument would stand at Fort Benning, right beside the main parade ground, not hidden away, not tucked behind bureaucracy and forgotten names. Out front, in the sun, where it could be seen, where it could stand tall. Ryan didn't just want a statue, he wanted a presence. He worked with artists, with engineers, with former Rangers who flew in from across the country. He didn't just want names on a slab. He wanted the truth shaped in bronze. The final sculpture was of 6 men standing back-to-back in a defensive ring, weapons lowered, eyes focused. Not soldiers charging, not flag-waving, just standing their ground, ready, steady, alone together. One figure bore the unmistakable profile of Thomas Hawkins. The others weren't exact portraits, too little photo evidence survived, but each one had pieces of the real men. A crooked grin, a carved belt buckle, a patch just a bit off-center. At the base, etched into black stone, were the names: Sergeant Lewis Barker, CPL Halverson Reed, Lieutenant Michael T. Grant, Private Eli Sanchez, Captain Raymond Cole, M. Sergeant Thomas Hawkins, and beneath that, the words, "Some ghosts are worth remembering." The unveiling brought hundreds, active Rangers, retired Green Berets, even Marines and airborne from units stationed halfway across the world. They stood in full uniform, lining the field, shoulder to shoulder, in the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Ryan took the stage last. He wasn't much of a speechmaker, never had been. But standing there in front of that monument, that bracelet tight on his wrist, he felt the words come. "I didn't know Thomas Hawkins until the last year of his life," he said. "And yet somehow I feel like I've known him my whole life. I feel like I've been walking in his footsteps since before I was even born." He paused. "My grandfather died on the other side of the world, on a mission the government erased. But Thomas didn't let him be forgotten. For 50 years he carried silence, pain, memory, until one day he handed it to me, and I carry it now not out of burden, but out of honor." He looked down at the statue. "And I promise you, every ranger I train, every soldier I meet will know who you are, will know what you did, because silence may protect secrets, but memory protects legacy." He stepped back and saluted. The sound of rifles cracked the sky. The bugler played taps. A single gold star mother sobbed into her hand as the flag was lowered and folded. Afterward, people lingered. Children traced the names with their fingers. Veterans stood with bowed heads. Young soldiers took pictures, not for Instagram, but for memory. And Thomas Hawkins, who had once been invisible, was now immortal. Years passed. Ryan climbed ranks, became a captain, then a major, eventually colonel. He trained units that went into the worst places on Earth, and in every single unit photo, the bracelet could be seen on his wrist. Eventually, he retired, started a small foundation in Thomas's name to help track down and support families of forgotten missions. He spoke at schools, at boot camps, at graduations, and every time he told the story of the ghost, of the bench in the park, of the bracelet, of the quiet man who changed everything without ever asking for credit. One afternoon, long after his last deployment, Ryan walked that same trail in the park, gray in his beard now, slower in his step. A teenage boy jogged past, then doubled back. "Hey," the boy said, panting, "that bracelet, that looks like—" Ryan smiled. "It is." The boy's eyes widened. "Is it really the bracelet?" Ryan nodded. "It is." The boy stood straighter. "My grandfather told me that story. He was a smart man then." The boy looked down. "I'm joining the Rangers next summer." Ryan looked him over. "Then carry this," he said, and began to unbuckle the bracelet. The boy's hands trembled. "I couldn't." "You will," Ryan said. "You have to." He pressed the bracelet into the boy's palm. And just like that, the legacy lived on, not in parades, not in textbooks, but in quiet moments, in passing hands, in memory, because some ghosts don't haunt, they guide. That evening, after the park had emptied and twilight blanketed the trees in violet hues, Ryan sat alone on the same bench where Thomas Hawkins had fed squirrels all those years ago. The space beside him felt full, though no one sat there. He could almost hear the rustle of the paper bag, the quiet sigh before the old man would toss a crust of bread. The memory was that vivid, that close. He looked out across the grass, where families laughed and barbecued under the fading sun. Kids tossed footballs, dogs chased sticks. The normalcy of it all, the peacefulness, made his chest ache. Not from grief, from gratitude. Everything Thomas had done, everything he'd carried in silence, had led to this. To parks full of life, to generations that didn't have to hide what they'd been through, to ghosts that no longer had to vanish into quiet apartments and eat dinner alone. The bracelet now rested on a wrist that wasn't his. And that was exactly how it should be. Somewhere out there, another young ranger would carry it into places most men would never see, would feel the cold press of the metal before a jump, would clutch it before a raid, would whisper a name into the dust and sweat and darkness, not even knowing exactly why, only that it mattered. Ryan stood. His knees cracked, and he chuckled softly to himself. "You'd be laughing at me, old man," he muttered to the sky. A breeze stirred the trees. Nothing dramatic, just enough to move the leaves, just enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He turned toward the trail and walked slowly back to the parking lot. The sky overhead turned to stars, and somewhere, in a place beyond time, Thomas Hawkins watched with that quiet, tired smile of his, not proud, not boastful, just peaceful, because he knew now, without a doubt, he had never truly been forgotten, and the mission had never really ended. It had simply passed on. The following spring, the Army held its annual Memorial Day ceremony at Fort Benning, and for the first time in its long history, a segment was officially dedicated to a mission that had never appeared in official records. A black-and-white photo of 6 young men in jungle fatigues was printed on the program beneath the words, "Harvest Light, Forgotten No More." The guest of honor was not a politician nor a general. It was the teenage boy who now wore the bracelet. His name was Caleb. He stood behind the podium in a crisp uniform that still looked slightly too big for him. His voice shook as he began to speak, but he didn't falter. "I never knew Thomas Hawkins personally," he said, "but I wear what he wore. I walk the path he cleared, and I carry the silence he endured. He lived most of his life in the shadows, not because he was ashamed, but because he was loyal. He waited until the world was ready to listen, and now we are." The audience sat in stunned silence. Behind Caleb, etched in the glass wall of honor, was a new quote, one that Thomas had spoken in the documentary and had since been immortalized. "Some wars you survive, others you carry." Caleb stepped down, his face pale, but his eyes burning. In the front row, Ryan sat watching, his hands folded, the corners of his mouth twitching with something between pride and reverence. His time was passing, and that was good, because it meant the story would outlive him. After the ceremony, families approached Caleb, mothers, widows, children now in their 60s who had never stopped hoping for closure. One woman pressed a photo into his hand. Another hugged him for too long. A young girl gave him a drawing of a man in uniform holding the hand of a child in a field of sunflowers. Caleb blinked fast to keep from crying. Later that evening, Ryan invited him to walk the path in the park, the same one he'd walked with Thomas. They walked in silence for a long while, listening to the wind in the trees and the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. "I wasn't ready for today," Caleb admitted. "No one ever is," Ryan replied. "But it felt right, like I was supposed to be the one." "You were," Ryan said. "You are." They reached the bench. Caleb stared at it for a moment. Then, slowly, carefully, he sat. "I thought it would feel different," he said. Ryan smiled faintly. "It always does, until it doesn't. Then one day you'll sit here and feel like you've sat here 100 times before." Caleb looked down at the bracelet. "Did you ever want to take it off?" "Plenty," Ryan said. "But I didn't, because it wasn't about me. It was about remembering." He nodded toward the trees. "You know what Thomas told me once?" "What?" "That every man gets 2 deaths. The first when his heart stops, the second when someone says his name for the last time. He made me promise no one would get their second death." "I'll remember that," Caleb whispered. "I know you will." They sat for a while longer, saying nothing, just listening. Then Ryan stood. "Come on," he said, "let's go home." Caleb rose, the bracelet catching a flicker of the sunset as it peeked through the pines. The light touched the bench, the trail, the trees. And somewhere, maybe not far at all, Thomas Hawkins walked beside them. Not as a ghost, but as memory made flesh, alive in every name spoken, alive in every step taken, alive in the silence finally broken, because legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what walks forward in your name. The bracelet continued its quiet journey across generations. Years passed. Caleb, once nervous behind a podium, became a respected team leader, known for his calm under fire and his relentless focus on protecting his men. They called him Echo because his orders always rang clear, even in chaos. But those who knew the story understood the real echo he carried wasn't in his voice. It was in the bracelet. He never took it off. Through every deployment, every jump, every sleepless night staring into foreign darkness, he kept it close, feeling the weight of the mission, of the men who came before. On bad days, he'd run his thumb across the ridged edge, just once. It grounded him, reminded him he wasn't the first to feel afraid, wasn't the first to push through. He started keeping a journal, not the kind that spilled emotions or dreams, but a record, stories, lessons, little things Thomas had said to Ryan, things Ryan had said to him, things he'd learned on his own. He called it the Silent Torch. He never planned to share it. But after a particularly rough op in the Middle East, one that left 2 new recruits broken and disoriented, Caleb handed the journal to the youngest. No explanation, just a nod. A few days later, the recruit came back with new eyes. Stronger, steadier. Word spread. Soon soldiers began leaving their own notes in the back of the journal, then drawings, then prayers. Over time, the Silent Torch became something more, a living document passed between rangers like sacred scripture. It never stayed long with one person. It traveled, like the Bracelet. 10 years later, Caleb stood at Arlington, older now, gray around the temples, his frame a bit heavier, slower. He stood not for himself, but for Ryan. The man who had handed him the torch had finally been laid to rest beside his grandfather in the soil they had all bled for. The funeral was private, just family, a few soldiers, and one folded flag. Caleb gave the eulogy. He didn't use notes, didn't need to. Ryan taught me that legacy isn't a statue, he said, voice firm. It's not a medal. It's not even a name carved in stone. It's what you give away while you're still here. It's what you leave in someone else's hands. He carried Thomas's story, and he gave it to me. And now... He looked at the young man standing near the casket, no older than 19, with fresh stripes on his sleeve and questions in his eyes. Caleb stepped down, took off the bracelet, walked over to him. "What's your name, son?" "Walker, sir. Private Walker." "You know what this is?" "Yes, sir. It's the story." Caleb nodded. "It's more than that. It's a promise." Then he held it out. Walker's fingers trembled as he accepted the bracelet. The metal was warm from years of skin and sun and soul. It wasn't jewelry, it was history. It was weight. He fastened it to his wrist. "Now it's yours," Caleb said. "And you protect it, not just the bracelet, the story, the silence, the men." "Yes, sir." The others stood in solemn silence, watching the transfer. The 4th generation. The torch passed again. That night, Walker opened the Silent Torch in his barracks. There, on the inside cover, he saw the very first entry written in shaky ink by a man named Thomas Hawkins. "If you're reading this, it means the silence is finally over. Don't let it return." Walker picked up his pen and wrote his name. Over the next several years, Private Walker became Sergeant Walker, then Staff Sergeant, eventually Lieutenant. But through every stage of his rise, he never forgot the day the bracelet was placed on his wrist. He never forgot the weight in Caleb's eyes, the finality in his voice, the sense that he wasn't just being given an object. He was being entrusted with an oath. And Walker took that oath seriously. He read the Silent Torch front to back, more times than he could count. It became his compass when things got dark, when decisions weighed heavy, when men under his command looked to him for answers he wasn't sure he had. He'd thumb the bracelet, read a passage, close his eyes, then move forward. He knew them all by name now. Lewis, Halverson, Grant, Sanchez, Cole, Hawkins. He whispered their names under his breath during moments of silence. He taught his unit about them, not as figures of the past, but as mentors who still walked alongside them, invisible yet present. In time, something new began happening. Other soldiers, young ones usually, with tired eyes and old souls, started coming to Walker privately, asking about the bracelet, about the story, about the journal. He didn't give them easy answers. Instead, he began copying pages from the Silent Torch. photocopies, folded and passed hand to hand, like underground scripture. Soon the base's coffee shop was unofficially known as Ghost Ground, not because it was haunted, but because soldiers gathered there in early hours to read, talk, and quietly reflect on what had come before. And then, after a particularly long stretch of back-to-back overseas deployments, Walker knew it was time. Time for the bracelet to move again. He didn't know who yet, so he waited. Then, one freezing January morning during Ranger training, he watched a young recruit in the snow. The kid was struggling, freezing, falling behind, but he never quit. Took every hit, every mistake, with grit in his teeth and fire in his eyes. Others grumbled. The kid never did. He just kept going. That night, Walker approached him in the mess hall. "What's your name, soldier?" "Mejia, sir. First name's Jordan." Walker sat across from him. "You ever heard of Harvest Light?" Jordan frowned. "Can't say I have." "You will." He told him everything, not the classified parts, but the heart of it, the silence, the bracelet, the men, the mission that never ended. Jordan didn't interrupt once. When Walker finished, he reached into his pocket, unfastened the bracelet, held it out. Jordan's mouth opened, then closed again. "I don't deserve that," he said. "No one ever does," Walker replied. "It's not about deserving. It's about remembering, carrying." Jordan took it with both hands, cradled it like glass, like truth. "Why me?" "Because you don't give up," Walker said. "Because I saw the ghost in your eyes." That night, Jordan couldn't sleep. He sat by his bunk under the dim light, flipping through the worn pages of The Silent Torch. He read Thomas Hawkins' first entry, then Ryan's, then Caleb's, then Walker's. When he reached the final page, it was blank. Waiting. He picked up his pen and began to write. PFC Jordan Mejia. I don't know what I've done to stand with men like this, but I'll do whatever it takes to be worthy of their names. I will carry the silence. I will remember the fallen. I will be their voice when the world forgets. The bracelet is on my wrist now. It's warm, heavy. I won't let it go cold. Time passed, and as it always does, history repeated. Not in war, but in the way memory lives through action. Jordan rose through the ranks. On missions, soldiers came to him with questions they couldn't ask anyone else. He listened, taught, passed out copies of The Silent Torch until he had to make a second journal, then a third. He never told anyone when he planned to pass the bracelet on. But one spring evening, standing at the edge of a live-fire exercise, he turned to a quiet, sharp-eyed recruit who reminded him of someone from long ago. "You know what this is?" Jordan asked. The recruit nodded. "Yes, sir. It's the mission." Jordan smiled and reached for his wrist. The sun dipped behind them, casting long shadows on the grass. And the bracelet passed again, not as metal, but as fire. Decades later, the story of the bracelet had grown far beyond any one man. It had become a rite of passage within certain circles. Among the elite units, there were whispers, not rumors, truths spoken softly, passed between generations like sacred code. It was never about medals, never about rank. It was about carrying the mission, carrying the silence. The original journal, The Silent Torch, had been digitally archived and stored in a secure server at Fort Liberty, accessible only by those in a narrow circle. But the physical copies, they were still being written by hand. Volume 7 had just been completed by Lieutenant Mejia, who now served as an instructor for one of the military's most advanced survival schools. His words, seasoned with years of pain, humor, and reverence, were passed to the next bearer along with the bracelet. The current keeper was a woman, Captain Lee Morrison. She was the first female recipient, not by design, but by destiny. She'd earned it like all the others had, through fire, through grit, through seeing her people broken and still lifting them back to their feet. She hadn't been told she was being considered. She hadn't known about the bracelet at all until the night Mejia called her to the training field. She'd just finished running a course. Mud on her face, blood on her knuckles. Laughing through split lips because she'd refused to tap out in a hand-to-hand demonstration with a man twice her size. Mejia handed her the bracelet with no speech. No announcement, just, "It's time." She looked down at it, confused. "What is this?" He said, "History." She hadn't taken it right away. It took her 3 days to accept it. 3 days of reading The Silent Torch, volume after volume, crying in her bunk at midnight as she read the first page from Thomas Hawkins, laughing at Caleb's dry wit, feeling the echo of Ryan's certainty, seeing Walker's strength in the lines, seeing Mejia's fire in the margins. Then she picked up her pen and began Volume 8. "My name is Captain Lee Morrison. I do not take this lightly. I know whose names are inside this bracelet. I know what it means to wear it. I will not fail them. I will not let silence take them back." She wore it into every op after that. It was there when she dragged a wounded team member 4 miles under enemy fire. There when she negotiated a hostage release in terrain so brutal even the extraction teams doubted they could make it out. There when she stared down an enemy soldier and convinced him to surrender his entire squad without a single bullet being fired. And it was there the night she returned to the States and stood in front of the memorial at Fort Benning, now expanded, now legendary. Tourists came to see it. Recruits were taken there before boot camp. But only a few ever truly understood. She stood in front of the 6 statues, the ring of brothers from Operation Harvest Light, and she saluted. Then she sat at the bench nearby, opened Volume 8, and started reading it aloud under her breath. 1 page, then 2, until the sun set, until the night air chilled, until the stars blinked into view like the watchful eyes of old friends. A recruit walking by recognized her, but didn't speak. Just slowed his pace, his eyes fixed on the bracelet. She looked up at him. "You want to know about this?" she asked. He nodded. She handed him the book. "Start reading." The recruit sat beside her, silent, eyes wide. When he finished the first page, he looked up. "This is real?" he asked. She smiled. "Very." "Where are the others?" She gestured to the sky. "Some are up there, some walk beside us." The recruit didn't speak again. He just kept reading. A week later, Morrison had her answer. She watched him through the next training cycle. Noticed the way he looked out for others. Noticed the way he ran toward trouble, not from it. Noticed the way he stayed after dark, helping someone who couldn't finish a climb. And so, as it had always happened, the moment arrived. Quiet, personal, sacred. She called him over, took off the bracelet, placed it in his hands, and said, "Don't carry it for me, carry it for them." He nodded, too choked up to answer. As he walked away, Morrison opened a new journal. Volume 9. I gave it to someone worthy, again. That's the only thing that matters. The bracelet passed on, and the light never dimmed. Years flowed like rivers, slow at times, raging at others, but the current never stopped, and neither did the bracelet. Captain Lee Morrison's chosen recruit, Private Daniel Cho, carried it next. He was young when he received it, barely 20. Green, quiet, but solid. The kind of soldier who didn't make excuses, who showed up early and left late, who paid attention to details others missed. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He was focused. It suited him. The bracelet stayed on his wrist through 3 tours, 2 evacuations, and 1 devastating ambush in the mountains of Uzbekistan where he was the only one who made it out uninjured. He didn't talk about that day, not even to the psychologists. But afterward, his entries in the Silent Torch grew longer, heavier, sharper. I kept hearing their voices, all 5 of them, telling me to move, to breathe, to live. I didn't just survive, I was carried. He became a mentor not long after that. started leading with quiet confidence, always watching, always listening, always carrying. At one point, when he was asked to speak at a leadership academy, he brought the bracelet, but not the journal, just the bracelet. He held it up in front of the room and said only, "This weighs less than 2 ounces, but it's the heaviest thing I own." Then he sat down. No applause, just silence. The kind of silence that meant everyone in that room had heard something that would stay with them. Eventually, like those before him, he knew when the time had come. The transfer happened in a hospital room, not his. The recipient was a medic who had taken shrapnel, saving a 3-man unit from a roadside blast. She was 24, a first-generation American. Her name was Yelena Torres. Her arm was in a sling. Her face was scarred, but her eyes burned with the same quiet fire Thomas Hawkins had once carried through jungle shadows. Daniel placed the bracelet on her nightstand without a word. When she woke and saw it, she stared at it for a long time. She didn't pick it up, not right away. It took her 6 weeks, 6 weeks of rehab, of pain, of reliving the moment again and again. But when she finally placed it on her wrist, her hand stopped shaking. She opened the silent torch, now in volume 10, and wrote, "I bled. I broke, but I didn't bow, and now I carry them with me, all of them." Torres returned to service stronger than before. She refused a discharge, recertified, passed every physical test again, and soon soldiers started following her, not because they had to, but because they trusted her. She never raised her voice, never pointed fingers, she just showed up. When her team lost a man in a surprise mortar strike, she stitched the others up under enemy fire and still radioed in the coordinates for extraction. The command officer later asked how she held herself together. Her answer, "I wasn't alone." She never told him what she meant. Only those who had carried the bracelet truly understood. The bracelet had become more than a symbol. It was a secret network of memory, a thread woven through time, invisible to most, but binding those who'd carried it in a quiet brotherhood, and now sisterhood, of shared silence. At reunions and memorials, those who'd once worn it found each other without a word. Just a glance, a nod, a pressure on the shoulder. There were no handshakes, no speeches, just presence. Sometimes one would whisper, "Still carrying?" and the other would smile or tear up or simply say, "Always." When Torres retired, she passed it on in the least likely place imaginable, a high school ROTC ceremony. One cadet, Elijah Brooks, had been quietly caring for his disabled mother, working nights, tutoring classmates, all while maintaining top scores in the unit. He didn't know the bracelet's history, not yet. But when Torres looked into his eyes, she saw something old, something steady. She knelt, an Army captain kneeling before a boy not yet enlisted, and fastened it to his wrist. "Remember this," she told him. "You are part of something greater. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." Elijah did not understand. Not then, but he would. Years later, when he walked through the gates of Fort Benning as a newly minted second lieutenant, a grizzled NCO caught a glimpse of the bracelet and went still. He walked over, stood at attention, and saluted without explanation. Elijah returned the gesture, confused but respectful. Later that night, he found the silent torch in his locker. Volume 11. Blank, waiting. And he understood. He sat on his bunk, picked up the pen, and began. "I don't feel worthy. But maybe no one ever does. Still, I'll carry it. For them. For what they lost. For what I hope to protect." Another hand. Another voice. Another light in the chain. And so the story continued. Elijah Brooks carried the bracelet with a mix of reverence and quiet fear. Not fear of battle, but of failing the legacy that now clung to his wrist like a second pulse. He was young, yes, but he learned quickly that the weight of memory could be heavier than any rucksack. The first months of active duty were brutal, not physically, that part he'd expected. It was the mental grind, the endless details, the way command could hollow out your soul if you let it. He had moments where he doubted everything, where he stared at the bracelet and whispered, "Why me?" But then came his first deployment. It wasn't flashy, not combat-heavy, a humanitarian operation in the wake of a flood that had swallowed entire villages in the Philippines. But there, among the ruins, something shifted in him. Elijah led his squad through waist-high water to evacuate stranded families, carried children on his back, dug out a trapped couple with his bare hands after a landslide. He didn't think of medals, didn't think of career paths. He thought of Thomas Hawkins wading through jungle silence, of Ryan and Caleb and Walker and Torres, all of them stepping forward not for glory, but because it had to be done. One night, soaked and exhausted, he stood alone on a rooftop overlooking a flooded town, the bracelet cold against his skin. The moon broke through clouds for the first time in days. He looked down and wrote in the silent torch, "This isn't the war I expected, but maybe that's the point. Legacy doesn't choose battles, it chooses people." He filled pages in the weeks that followed, stories of villagers who gave him shelter, of a little girl who offered him her last piece of candy because he looked tired, of his men laughing in ankle-deep water as they built makeshift bridges out of scrap and rope. When they returned stateside, command was impressed. Medals were issued. Elijah accepted them with humility, but never wore them in public. He wore only the bracelet. Back at base, new recruits asked questions, not about tactics, but about the way Elijah carried himself, calm, alert, always listening. One asked about the bracelet. Elijah only said, "You'll know when it's time." But deep down, he knew the time wasn't yet. He still had more to do. His next deployment came sooner than expected. This time, combat adjacent, a tense joint op in Eastern Europe where things escalated fast and unexpectedly. Hostile fire, civilian evacuations, a compound in flames. Elijah moved with eerie clarity. When comms went down, he re-established them under sniper watch. When his medic froze during a triage, he stepped in with bare hands and pressure-wrapped a wound while whispering steady words. He was awarded a Bronze Star. But that wasn't the moment. The moment came weeks later, back at base, when one of his soldiers, Private Velez, came to him in the dark of night, eyes red, voice shaking. "I can't do this," Velez said. "I thought I could, but I can't." Elijah didn't answer. He walked to his locker, pulled out the silent torch, and handed it over. "Read this," he said. "Then decide." Velez read all night. In the morning, he reported for PT with dry eyes and steady hands. He said only, "I get it now." Elijah nodded. Good. Time moved forward. The bracelet stayed. Until 1 year, during a training exchange with Allied forces in Africa, Elijah met someone who would change everything again. Her name was Lieutenant Saida Mwangi. She was Kenyan, a combat engineer, tough as iron, smart as hell, and carried herself like she had a storm tied behind her teeth. They sparred, argued, bonded over heat and dust and shared exhaustion. She wasn't impressed by medals, wasn't moved by stories, until she saw the bracelet. She asked about it once, just once. Elijah said, "It's not mine, it never was." And when the training operation turned real, a terror cell, ambushing a convoy of aid workers, Saida was the one who took point. She led the counter-response, recovered 3 hostages, took a bullet to the vest, didn't flinch. Elijah watched from the med tent later as she refused painkillers and helped patch up a private with a concussion. He knew she was the next. That night, under stars brighter than any he'd seen in years, he walked to her cot, held out the bracelet. She looked at him, frowning. "You sure?" she asked. "Completely." She hesitated, then fastened it onto her own wrist. "It's warm," she said, surprised. "It always is," Elijah replied. He handed her the silent torch. She opened the cover and stared at the list of names. Hawkins, Ryan, Caleb, Morrison, Torres, Brooks. "They're watching," he said quietly. She didn't answer, just nodded, and began to write. "I am not American, but courage speaks no language. This bracelet now belongs to a soldier of Africa. I will carry them with me across oceans, through fire, and beyond silence. Their war is my war, their light, mine to protect." The bracelet, once born in jungle fog and buried in secrecy, now circled the world. Its light never dimmed, its mission never ended. Years later, somewhere deep in the mountains of northern Afghanistan, Captain Saida Mwangi sat under a makeshift canopy beside a flickering fire. Wind howled beyond the stone ridges, and dust danced like spirits in the flames. Her team slept in shifts, weapons close, boots half-laced, the tension of the region pressing on them like the mountain air. On her wrist, the bracelet gleamed faintly in the firelight. It no longer looked like something passed through hands. It looked like something that had grown into her skin, an extension of who she was. She turned the pages of the silent torch, now worn soft and rippled from sweat and rain and time. Volume 12. She was the only one writing in it now, but she had a feeling it wouldn't be that way for long. This operation had been hard, deeper into hostile territory than she'd ever planned. The roads were treacherous, locals hesitant, intelligence fractured, and yet her team had moved like water, flexible and unbreakable. They'd stopped a hidden munition supply from falling into the hands of extremists. They'd done it without losing a single life. But it had been close. Too close. Private Jensen, her youngest, had frozen under fire, barely 18, his first mission. He'd panicked in the hills and nearly gave away their position. But instead of screaming at him, instead of dressing him down in front of the others, Saida had crouched beside him behind the outcropping and whispered the names: Lewis, Halverson, Grant, Sanchez, Cole, Hawkins. "Those men would have died for you," she'd said. "So now you live for them?" Jensen had nodded, eyes wild but clear. He'd moved, fought, survived. That night, she began a new entry. "There's no perfect soldier, only those who keep moving when the fear digs in. Jensen learned that today. I think he'll be ready." She closed the book, set it beside her cot, and stared out into the night. The moon hung low. The wind sang through the passes, and just past the firelight, the bracelet seemed to shimmer with its own quiet pulse. Months later, she returned to Nairobi for reassignment. She didn't talk much about Afghanistan, not to her family, not to the news outlets who wanted a hero's tale. She declined interviews, awards, speeches. Instead, she went back to training. She believed in building from the ground up. She believed the next one was already there, somewhere in the crowd of new cadets, blinking under sun and sweat and pressure. And she was right. His name was Kofi Owusu, Ghanaian, 20 years old, former bricklayer turned soldier, built like a truck but moved like wind. He didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. He never bragged, never showed off. But he noticed everything. One morning, while the others were dragging themselves through drills, he helped a fellow cadet to her feet without being told. Said, "You don't leave people behind." "Not ever." Saida heard it, didn't let on. She watched, waited. Then, during a final training op, when a simulated hostage extraction turned chaotic, Kofi led half the team out of the dark with no radio, no map, just instinct and a hand-drawn sketch on the back of a ration box. They emerged 30 minutes before anyone else. 0 errors. She knew. Later that night, under a lone tree on the edge of the training ground, she handed him the bracelet. He didn't understand at first. "What is this?" he asked. She said only, "Truth." She gave him the journal, said nothing else. The next morning, Kofi showed up to roll call with the bracelet on and a new look in his eye. Not pride, purpose. Later, in the quiet corner of his barracks, he opened the silent torch to a fresh page and wrote, "I come from red earth and open sky. My father laid bricks. My mother carried water. I carry this. For all of them, for every name before mine, for every name after." He carried it into deserts, into jungles, into border conflicts where no press cameras ever dared go. He earned the respect of every unit he joined, not with shouting, not with rank, but with calm and certainty. The bracelet earned glances, curious stares. But when asked, he would smile and say, "It belongs to those who walk forward." And in time, someone else would walk beside him, a sniper named Willa Reese. American, quiet, calculating, lethal at a distance but strangely poetic in thought. She once described the silence before a shot as a kind of peace. Kofi noticed the way she steadied others, the way she never needed to be told twice, the way she talked about her grandfather, who'd served in Vietnam, but never told her why he cried at church on Sundays. So when Kofi's time came, he passed it on to her. And Willa? Willa became a ghost of her own kind, the quiet guardian, the precision soul. She carried it through shadow ops, through frozen landscapes, through diplomatic back doors where steel nerves mattered more than steel barrels. She wrote few entries, but when she did, they sang. Some wars you fight with your hands, some with your heart. This bracelet is a compass for both. She carried it until her final deployment. Then, one evening, with her boots off, a cigarette burning low, she turned to a young interpreter named Amir, barely 22, fluent in 5 languages, scared stiff but never quit, and said, "It's your turn." And so the bracelet passed again, across oceans, across bloodlines, across beliefs, across the world, until it became more than a story. It became a myth with a heartbeat, a memory that walked, a legacy that refused to die. Because the silence had long since been broken, and now the light carried itself. Amir al-Masri had never intended to be part of anything legendary. Born in a refugee camp on the Syrian-Jordanian border, raised by a mother who taught English to displaced children, he spent his early years watching men with guns walk roads that used to be safe. He hadn't dreamed of war or honor or valor. He'd dreamed of books, of safety, of peace. And yet here he was, holding a bracelet that hummed with generations of sacrifice, that had crossed continents, carried by soldiers whose names were etched not into medals, but into each other's memory. Willa had passed it to him not with ceremony, but with gravity. They were alone in a dusty outpost near the Turkish border, watching the sun drop into the haze of desert gold. She took it off slowly, her fingers lingering on it for a moment before she placed it in his palm. "You earned it," she'd said. "I'm just an interpreter," Amir whispered. Willa's gaze didn't waver. "You saved 6 lives in that convoy ambush, including mine." "I was doing my job. So were all of them, and they carried it too." She handed him the silent torch, now in volume 13. "Add your chapter." He wore the bracelet for hours that night before daring to write. When he finally opened the journal, he stared at the blank page for a long time. Then slowly, in quiet script, he began. "I don't know if I'm worthy, but I know I'll never forget the sound of my name being called by those who believed I was. I carry this for them, for every child who waited for help that never came, for every voice lost in the rubble, for every soldier who gave me a place to stand." Amir's journey was different. He wasn't a traditional soldier. He wasn't trained in combat. But he became more than his title. Wherever he went, peace followed, not because he forced it, but because he understood how to listen. In one village along the northern border of Iraq, his presence stopped a firefight from erupting between 2 rival militias. He stood in the open, unarmed, holding up the bracelet. He spoke their language. He understood their wounds. He said, "This has been passed from warrior to warrior, but it has never spilled innocent blood. Do not make it start now." The men lowered their weapons and walked away. That day, Amir wrote one of the shortest entries in the journal. Today, the bracelet spoke. Word of him spread, not in military channels, not in press headlines, but among those who walked dark corners, among those who knew what it meant to lead without needing the last word, among those who believed that legacy was forged not in battles, but in the space between them. Eventually, Amir returned to Jordan to care for his ailing mother. He taught children how to read, trained young translators to work with peacekeeping units, and when he knew the time had come, he called a young cadet named Noura Samar to his side. She had been his brightest student, quick with her tongue, fierce in debate, the granddaughter of a Lebanese Red Cross medic who once served in Beirut under fire. She was barely 20, but carried herself like she was much older. He told her the story, the whole story, from Thomas Hawkins to now. She wept when he handed her the bracelet. "This doesn't belong on me," she whispered. "That's what every one of us said," Amir replied. She put it on. Later that night, she opened the Silent Torch, Volume 14, and wrote, "They said I was too young, too small, too loud, but this bracelet doesn't care about size or silence. It cares about strength, and I have enough to carry it." Noura became the first to wear it into a United Nations peacekeeping mission. She crossed borders not with soldiers at her back, but with medics, engineers, and builders. She rebuilt schools, cleared mines, trained teenage girls in self-defense. Her uniform bore no nation's flag, but she carried the weight of all of them on her wrist. The bracelet changed in her time. It had once symbolized war. Now it began to mean healing. Wherever Noura went, people began asking, not what battles had been fought, but what peace had been made. And she told them, quietly, in circles, in classrooms, in firelit shelters, under battered roofs. When she returned to New York to speak at the United Nations International Peace Forum, she wore the bracelet openly, not as a relic, but as a declaration. She stood at the podium and said, "This bracelet has seen war, has crossed deserts and jungles, oceans and generations. But the most powerful thing it has ever done is bring people together." The crowd stood in ovation. In the weeks after her speech, stories emerged. Families traced the names in the Silent Torch to their ancestors. Students in military academies began asking to read it. Veterans who hadn't spoken in decades wrote in saying, "I remember." Noura didn't keep the bracelet long after that. She knew it was time. She returned to Lebanon, to the ruins of an old hospital where her grandmother had once bandaged soldiers in 1983. There, she met a young Syrian nurse named Tarek, who had crossed 2 borders to save a village under siege. He was tired, brave, humble. And when he held the bracelet, he didn't speak. He just nodded. She passed it to him with both hands. "It's yours now," she said. Tarek placed it on his wrist, kissed it like sacred cloth, opened Volume 15, and wrote, "I do not come from soldiers. I come from hands that heal. But even healing carries the burden of war, and I will carry it well." The bracelet had left battlefields behind. Now it walked into clinics, schools, refugee tents, storm zones, wherever the world cried out for light. It had become more than legacy. It had become a movement. And still it passed. Years turned to decades, and the bracelet, once born in the bloody dust of war, had traveled farther than any single person could follow. It was whispered about in corners of the world most maps didn't show. In earthquake camps, in remote outposts, in flooded villages where soldiers in camouflage and civilians in rubber boots moved side by side. By the time it reached its 100th bearer, the name Thomas Hawkins had become something sacred. not because he was a hero in the traditional sense, but because he was the first to carry silence without letting it win. Volume 20 of The Silent Torch was stored in a fireproof case now, carried not just in bags but in digital scans, translated into over 20 languages. The stories within were read in military academies, humanitarian training camps, and university ethics courses. Not one of the writers had ever asked for recognition, but every one of them had written the truth. It had become tradition for each new bearer to write 2 entries, one when they received the bracelet and one when they passed it on. The first was usually a promise, the second a reflection, but the 100th bearer broke that rule. Her name was Dr. Layla Omondi, a trauma surgeon working with a joint international relief team after a series of coordinated bombings across multiple East African cities. She didn't carry a rifle. She carried gauze, bone saws, saline. Her uniform was stained red more often than not. Her hands never stopped moving. The bracelet had come to her unexpectedly, passed by a Marine engineer who had watched her revive a child with no pulse in the back of a flatbed truck while mortar fire echoed in the distance. He said only, "It's yours now. You kept the heart beating." Layla hadn't written in the journal for weeks, not because she was ungrateful, but because she wasn't ready. The bracelet felt heavy, yes, but it also felt familiar, like it had waited for her, like it knew her hands had already carried it in spirit. Then, one sleepless night, beneath a canvas roof in a city without electricity, she opened Volume 21. She wrote only, "Some carry weapons, some carry words. I carry life, and with this bracelet I carry all who came before me, not to remember pain, but to honor what was done in spite of it." The entries that followed over the next year were raw. They weren't about gunfire. They were about hands holding hands through pain, about whispering prayers over strangers, about losing patience and still waking up to try again. She wrote of cultures blending in the most beautiful ways, of a Tongan medic and a Kurdish pilot learning Swahili so they could crack jokes with locals, of a Canadian logistics officer carrying water jugs 2 miles on foot in 120-degree heat because the truck had broken down. She wrote about one young volunteer, barely 21, who had arrived terrified, shaking, and unsure, and who, by the end of 3 months, had led an emergency evacuation of 200 civilians through flooded terrain without losing a single life. That volunteer's name was Jamila Noor. And Dr. Omondi knew. She called her to the tent the night before her own departure. The bracelet sat on the table between them. "I can't," Jamila began. "You can," Layla said softly, "because you already have." Jamila's hand trembled as she took it, her eyes wet, her heart full. That night she opened the journal to her first page and wrote, "I was born in a city torn by war. I never imagined I'd be the one pulling others from the wreckage. But the bracelet found me. And now I know we don't choose the mission chooses us." Years passed. Volume 25, then 30, then 35. The bracelet traveled across hands that looked nothing alike. Black, brown, white, scarred, inked, calloused, soft. It crossed faiths, genders, borders. It belonged to no country, no single language. It belonged only to the ones who carried the weight of silence and chose to speak through action. One day, at a mountain base in Nepal, after a landslide decimated 4 villages, a young man from Mumbai named Arjun stepped onto a pile of rubble and found a girl buried alive. He didn't hesitate, dug for hours with his hands, screaming for help in 5 languages until others came. He saved her. And later, as the medics worked on his shredded hands, a woman placed the bracelet in his lap without a word. He looked up, confused. "I don't understand," he said. "You will," she whispered. And that night he opened the latest journal, Volume 40, He saw names from every continent. He saw drawings, quotes, maps, doodles from children, tear-stained fingerprints, and at the very front, photocopied from Volume 1, always preserved, the original line by Thomas Hawkins. If you're reading this, it means the silence is finally over. Don't let it return. Arjun read it again, and again. And then, slowly, he picked up a pen, and the legacy continued. Somewhere far from war zones, in a classroom tucked behind a weathered red brick building in a quiet French village, the bracelet sat, for the first time in decades, on a desk beside a piece of chalk. The man who wore it now was no soldier, no medic, no frontline warrior. His name was Auguste Lemoine, once a logistics specialist for NATO, now a teacher of world history in a town of 1,300 people. How it came to him wasn't public. No one knew about the convoy in Romania that had nearly collapsed after a bridge was bombed. No one had seen him swim across icy water to bring medicine to a children's hospital left stranded. Only one man had witnessed it, a colonel, retired and half-crippled by a past no one asked about. And that colonel, without fanfare, had passed him the bracelet. "You're the first man I've met in 20 years who didn't talk about being brave. You just were." That was years ago. Auguste had worn the bracelet ever since. He never spoke of it. But his students noticed. One asked if it was for luck. Another guessed it was religious. He never answered. Then one day, a boy in the back of the room raised his hand, not for a question, but to say his brother had returned from deployment and never spoke again, never smiled, just stared out the window at night. "Is he broken?" the boy asked. The class froze, and Auguste, calm, pale, weathered, reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a black journal, Volume 41. He set it on the table. "He's not broken," Auguste said. "He's carrying something." The students leaned in. The journal looked old, used, reverent. "He's not talking because he doesn't know how to explain the weight. Not yet." Then he slid the journal toward the boy. "Give him this. Tell him it's from someone who understands." That was the first time in 2 decades that a civilian family received the silent torch. The boy's brother opened the journal that night. He read every word, didn't sleep. In the morning, he wrote a note inside. "I thought I was the last one still carrying the silence, but it turns out we're all just echoes of the same promise." From that moment, something changed again. The bracelet had always passed from action to action, from mission to mission. But now it was finding new ways to move. Through classrooms, through dinner tables, through the private ache of those who never wore a uniform but carried war inside them anyway. Therapists began referencing entries in trauma recovery groups. Veterans' hospitals requested digital scans of the volumes, and in one mental health center in Oregon, a former Army Ranger named Louis Santiago, once a hard-drinking, fight-prone ghost of himself, picked up a photocopied page and sobbed for the first time in 15 years, not from weakness, but from recognition. "They knew," he whispered. They all knew. And for the first time since returning home, he wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular, just a letter. It was added to Volume 42. By now, the silent torch had become something larger than paper. A foundation was formed, quietly. No big campaign, just a network. Veterans, medics, volunteers, interpreters, peacekeepers who kept the promise alive, who kept the silence from coming back. One of them was a 10-year-old girl named Lian, born in a temporary shelter in coastal Myanmar. Her village had been destroyed by flooding. Her parents were gone, but she survived. And when a disaster relief volunteer who had once worn the bracelet found her scribbling in the mud with a stick, he gave her a notebook. Inside the back cover, he wrote, "Write anything, just don't stop." Lian wrote stories every day. At 13, she won a scholarship to a school in Thailand. At 15, she published a small book of essays. At 16, during a visit to a youth conference in Geneva, a woman approached her and placed a faded bracelet into her palm. "You already carry so many," the woman said. "This one belongs with you now." Leon's eyes welled. She knew what it was. She had read the stories, translated half of them for her classmates. She wore it during her speech at the summit, and said only, "The people who pass this bracelet on, they don't do it for medals or glory. They do it so someone else doesn't have to carry the silence alone." And now, it's my turn. The video went viral. Millions watched, cried, asked questions, and a new chapter began. Young people across the world began sharing their own silent torch journals, from slums to cities, from war zones to Wi-Fi cafes. The bracelet now existed in hundreds of forms, not replicas, but echoes, each one tied to the original, to the vow Thomas Hawkins had made so long ago when he whispered 2 words into a phone and broke 50 years of silence. Son, now. Somewhere in a quiet museum outside D.C., under special lighting and protective glass, the original bracelet and the first 3 volumes of the Silent Torch rest on display. Visitors walk past daily, some unaware, others stopping in reverence. But even as the original rests in safety, the legacy marches on. Because the mission was never about the metal, it was always about the light, carried forward in one hand at a time.